Hey guys, it's Brandon. Wanted to take a look today at one of the most famous and controversial and important chess games of the modern chess era. And of course I'm referring to game 2 of the 1997 match between Deep Blue and Garry Kasparov. So Deep Blue, the IBM supercomputer, taking on Garry Kasparov, greatest player of all time, probably, world champion, strongest player certainly at that time, and was taking on the best computer in the world in a 6-game match. And he had beaten the last version of Deep Blue in 1996 4-2, and had won game 1 of this match with the white pieces. And now so we come to this game 2, which was controversial because lots of chess experts and Garry Kasparov himself thought that Deep Blue played a very uncomputer-like game, specifically one move, such to the point that the Kasparov camp and Garry himself accused the IBM staff of cheating. So for this game, I wanted to, because it's such a famous game, I wanted to, I think there might be a good number of people who search for this game on YouTube who are not chess aficionados or not chess experts, who don't know a lot about opening theory or how the game is really played. So I wanted to try to keep variations to a minimum and just try to explain sort of qualitatively why things about this game, why this particular move was so hard for Garry Kasparov to believe could be played by a computer at this time, and just sort of talk about the game in general and a little bit about the history. And still, I hope that even more experienced chess players can get something out of this game, or as I annotated here. So Deep Blue was playing with the white pieces, and Garry Kasparov was playing with the black pieces. So the game opened with Deep Blue playing 1 e4, king's pawn opening, and Garry Kasparov responded with the move 1 e5. This is already slightly unusual because Garry Kasparov is famous for almost always playing the Sicilian defense, especially later on in his career. Earlier in his career, he played some other defenses, but he almost always played the Sicilian defense to 1 e4 later on in his career. And this move is marked by the move 1 c5 as a response to the move 1 e4. And the games that come from this opening are often characterized by their attacking and tactical nature. And it was part of Garry's strategy for this match that he wanted to play into positions that were not of a tactical nature and were more of a closed positional nature, where both sides are fighting for control of squares and they're not really directly attacking each other. Because he wanted to play a game where he was minimizing the power of the computer to calculate positions. So he didn't want to get into tactical games where the computer is very, very, very strong, even at that time. Nowadays they're ridiculously strong, but even back then they were extremely strong at calculating tactical games, tactical combinations, attacking combinations, things like this. And he wanted to play a more quiet game so that he could strategically outplay the computer, which is why he played the move e5. And what resulted was, after knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, the Roy Lopez, one of the most famous and well-worn openings in chess. After a6, bishop a4, knight f6, castles, bishop e7, Kasparov is opting to play a closed Roy Lopez, and even more than some other variations of the Roy Lopez. This setup with the pawn coming here to d6, the bishop here on e7, some castling, and some development of pieces marks a defense where black is willing to just sort of set up a solid position and play slowly and see if he can squeeze out any advantage later in the game. So now after the move, I would just briefly mention that it looks like in this position, for those of you unfamiliar, white is threatening to take this knight and then take this pawn, because this knight is defending the pawn after the move a6. So like this. However, black has the important resource now after this queen d4, which simultaneously attacks the knight and the pawn on e4. So he'll get the pawn back. The knight has to move or be protected, and then he'll get this pawn back with check. So that's why it's not possible at this point for black to win white to win a pawn. So that's why you don't see black early on in this type of game trying to defend this e-pawn right away. But after castles, bishop e7, and rook e1, this is now a threat to win the pawn. This bishop takes knight capture. If black just simply castles here, for instance, then white can play takes, and here, and there's no time for white to win back this e-pawn, even though he has two attackers on it. It looks like he could still win it because there's two attackers, and he has to do something about this knight. Because when the knight moves back to f3, it's attacking the queen, and the queen can't be the first one to take because then it just gets taken by the rook. So he has to move the queen, which then gives white enough time to put one more defender on the pawn. So that's why after the move rook to e1, the response is always b5 from black. So now the bishop cannot take the knight and of course has to retreat. So that's just a little finesse in the opening of this game. And now black plays the move d6. This is pretty common. And now white plays the move c3. The point of this move is to give the bishop, the light square bishop, a hideaway square in case black ever tries to play knight a5 and try to pick up the two bishops. In this position, if you could play knight a5 here, this bishop would have nowhere to go, and black would be able to pick up the two bishops. So until this move d6, of course, this knight was not able to move because if this knight moved, then this pawn would just be hanging. So once this pawn is now defended again, it threatens that this knight might move and try to grab the bishop pair, which is why c3 is played. And in addition, c3 prepares the advanced d4 to try to gain some space and a pawn center for white. So castles, this is pretty common. And now h3. This is very standard closed Roy Lopez. Almost all closed Roy Lopez's start out this way. The point of this h3 move is to prevent the bishop from coming here to put a pin on the knight, and also pressure on the d4 pawn, because white would like to push d4 here in the center and be able to maintain a pawn here on e4 and d4 as long as possible, or until he deems that it is his benefit to push the pawn or do something about this pawn setup in the center. If he pushes d4 first and allows this bishop to come out here, putting pressure on this knight, which is protecting this pawn, then black can try to gang up on this d4 pawn and force white to either push it forward or to exchange it earlier than he might want to. So white takes a minute to stop this bishop from coming here. And now black has a number of responses. The main line for most of chess history, I guess, in the early days, and maybe even still the main line today, I'm not sure, is to play this move knight to a5, chase this bishop back to c2, and then play c5. This is called the Chigorin variation. Other options are the move knight b8. This is the Breyer variation, where on the next move the knight will just reroute here. The Zaitsev right now would be to play bishop to b7. That's a move that was actually used against Kasparov a lot by Karpov, rather unsuccessfully, admittedly, in the 80s. And there may be some others that I'm forgetting, but Kasparov chose this move h6, which is the Smyslov defense. Less popular, considered extremely solid, and extremely passive for black. So this is just, again, fitting into his strategy of playing solid, blocked up, passive game where the two armies are not really coming into direct contact with each other. Because really, when you want to play a tactical, aggressive, attacking game, you need to generate positions where both of your armies are in contact with each other. And by that I mean your pieces are attacking things. Your pieces are attacking your other opponent's pieces, so that you can try to generate some tactics by, deflecting pieces away from guarding certain other pieces, so you can try to win material that way. But really the pieces sort of need to be within sight of each other, within contact with each other. You'll notice that in this particular opening, nobody has pieces from either side that are attacking any of the other pieces on the other side. Just some pawns are being pressured. This bishop has some pressure on this pawn, this knight has some pressure on this pawn, and this knight has some pressure on this pawn. But other than that, there are no pieces attacking other pieces, and there are no pawns, ready to push forward and chase pieces away, things like this. So this is a rather strategic and slow game, which is exactly what Garry Kasparov wanted. And he thought that the computer in these types of positions where they can't calculate tactics and attacks and stuff like that are not really going to know what to do. And this was actually a rather successful strategy for computers right up until this particular game. And this game sort of changed the way that we think about computers as machines that are capable of playing a slow, strategic game. Of course, the controversy is that maybe they weren't really that good at it at this point, and there was some cheating involved. But in any case, after this move, h6, white played d4. This is very common, setting up some space in the center, getting the two nice pawns here. And of course, if black at any point chooses to play e takes d4, white will recapture with the d pawn and then have two nice mobile pawns in the center. So rook e8, this is all theory. Knight bd2, bishop f8, and the point of this maneuver here with the rook and the bishop is to tuck the bishop away, which is really blocked in by these pawns here. But on the other hand, from here, defends a lot of these dark squares and makes it very difficult for white to come up with an attack. Additionally, this rook is keeping an eye on the e pawn, so keeping an eye on this strong point for black. And so knight f1, this is a very common Roy Lopez maneuver. Both this maneuver with the bishop and the rook here and this knight maneuver eventually coming here to g3 are routine in pretty much all positions of the closed Roy Lopez. Both sides play for this kind of thing. So bishop d7, just developing a piece. I'm not sure if this is still theory. Probably it is, but I'm not sure what the difference between that and putting the bishop on b7 are in this particular opening. I don't play it myself. So knight to g3. So from here, the knight protects the e pawn. So that's one thing that it does, and it also eyes the f5 square. And if this knight could ever get into f5, it would be putting a lot of pressure on some sensitive points in the black position, namely the g7 and h6 squares. So the knight could be a very important attacking piece here on f5. That's why this maneuver is played in so many of these Roy Lopez positions. So here Kasparov chose the move knight a5, and what this move does is unblock the c pawn with a tempo because white wants to hold on to this bishop, and now he gets to play the move c5. So putting more pressure on this pawn in the center and sort of getting some space for himself on the queen side. White plays this move b3. The point of this move is to cut out any future for this knight on the king side, or to come into the square c4. So this knight is kind of a little bit badly placed here on the rim. Its only real possibilities to move into white's camp are these two squares, which are cut out from its access. So that's why the next move we see from Kasparov is knight to c6, just to reposition the knight and hope that maybe at some point down the road he can get this knight to d7 out here, maybe to try to find some better life for the knight. And that's sort of a common thing in most of these closed Roy positions, is what really to do with this knight that was here on c6. But okay, and the reason he did that right away is because he wanted to get this move in before Deep Blue played its next move, d5. If the knight was still here when Deep Blue had played d5, then he would only have this square to go back to, and that's kind of an awkward square. And it's unclear what his future is here. But now that he has this piece here, he has time to move the knight to e7. So Kasparov was probably happy with his position at this point. You'll notice that Deep Blue committed in the center. It's got a space advantage, but now you'll notice the pawn formation in the center is completely blocked up. So there's not going to be a whole lot of action going on there, and it's just sort of going to come down to who plays better on the wings. Deep Blue can argue that it has a little bit of a space advantage. It's maintained the two bishops. the black pieces are sort of cramped on the back two ranks mostly. It's a nice position for white, but again, it's very solid for black and very hard to break down. And Kasparov was betting that the computer would not be able to come up with a good, sufficient positional plan in this type of position to get a win. And to be fair to him, having already won game one, a draw with the black pieces in this type of position is probably sufficient for him. So I think he thought he was playing a no-risk game here. So the computer played the move bishop e3, just developing another piece. And Kasparov rerouted his knight to g6, just trying to open up the the rook to keep protection here, adding another defender to this point. And similarly to white's knight on to g5, this black knight may have a future on the f4 square, where it could have some active possibilities. So Deep Blue finished his development with this move queen to d2, just connecting the rooks, getting his last piece into the game. And Kasparov at this point decided to undertake a strategy where he was going for an exchange of some minor pieces. And this is one of the things that you do when you have less space, less room for your pieces to move around. You try to relieve some of that spatial pressure by exchanging pieces, thus having more room for your pieces to move around in a limited amount of space. So he played this move knight h7. It looks a little weird to stick this knight here in the corner, but what he's looking to do is trade off this knight here on h4 for this knight here. And now the queen is protecting this square. And we see this move come in pretty quickly. Deep Blue plays the move a4. This is an absolutely common move for the computer to be playing, just trying to open up the queen side and get some play on that side of the board. And now, okay, knight h4 comes in, and probably Deep Blue does not want to allow the knight to just capture here and be forced to play g takes and break up the king side. Actually, that would probably immediately lose a pawn if he allowed that, because if knight takes knight, knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, then the bishop is attacking this pawn. So he doesn't really want to allow that, and he doesn't want to waste time defending the knight with a move like queen e2. The queen, it's unclear what the queen would be doing on f3. So instead he just opts for the trade. So Kasparov has successfully traded off one set of minor pieces, so slightly relieving this cramped space, but also getting his queen in the general vicinity of the black king. And this knight may have ideas at some point in the future of hopping in here onto g5, maybe putting some pressure on this square. You know, these pieces of the knight from here would put pressure on here, and there could be some sacrifices, there could be some attacking ideas. You never know. So the computer played a move, queen e2, and this move does a couple of things. First of all, it puts pressure on this b5 pawn, so it's defended enough at the moment because of the bishop, but now the bishop can't really move away from this diagonal, because then he would drop a pawn, so he's tying the bishop down a little bit to this square. And also, if the knight ever came in to this g5 square, then white might have the nice defense queen to h5, just offering a trade of queens, and thus snuffing out any attack before it sort of gets started. So Kasparov responded with the move queen to d8, and now came the move b4. So stretching out on the queen side for white, stopping black from playing b4 at any point. And now this move makes it so that you're sort of reducing the choices and possibilities for black on the queen side, because black doesn't really want to take this pawn, because after a move like this, white is going to get very fast pressure on this weak a6 pawn, which can't really move forward. And this is not the type of position that black wants to play, because it's just giving a very obvious and very easy target for white to pick on the a file. So by playing b4, it's sort of limiting the options for black. And now Kasparov played this move queen c7, which was followed up by a very deep and long-term move played by Deep Blue, rook c1. The point of this is to place the rook on the on the same file as the queen, so that you're eliminating further more possibilities from black. So if black is ever really thinking about exchanging here on the c file, then the rook will be directly attacking the queen, and there could be many variations where this bishop suddenly moves out of the way into a better position, which would come with tempo because the rook would be attacking the queen. And it just sort of takes away more possibilities from black. And in the spirit of his strategy, Kasparov did not want to allow the computer any tactics, so he played the move c4. This isn't normally the kind of move you want to play in this type of position, because you're eliminating any real active counterplay chances for you on the queen side. Really, because of the reason I mentioned before, this pawn capture is never really possible, and the only person who has play on the queen side is white, in the form of at some point capturing on b5 and then trying to do something on the open a file, which we'll see later. So you're sort of admitting when you play this move c4 that only white will have chances for play on the queen side. And on the other hand, on the king side, it's hard to drum up anything. So at this point, Kasparov was really just saying, I'm going to keep my position solid, and you're not really going to, and I don't think the computer is going to find a positional plan to beat me in this position. So the computer continued with the move rook a3, just preparing to double rooks, and then at some point open the a file and try to invade with the rooks and the heavy pieces on the a file. And Kasparov, seeing that he was planning to double rooks, decided to try to cover the a file via this maneuver, rook to c8, with the idea of moving the queen here so that he'd have enough defense on the a8 square. So for example, rook ac1, and now queen to d8. Now if this pawn capture happens, black has enough defense on the rooks that he's not losing a piece. So this position would be totally fine because now black is the one who has penetration down the a file. So this would, of course, the computer would never do this, but he just needed to be able to defend, because with these rooks doubled, if he doesn't move this queen now to defend, black is just threatening to capture here and then just have total control of the a file. So just to illustrate, a random move here like this, and now there's no possibility to capture with the pawn here because it's just losing a rook. And if instead black decides just to give up the a file, just to move the rook out of this pressure, well then white has very nice play, moving the rook in combination with this bishop and this rook onto the 7th rank, attacking a lot of stuff, and this position is significantly better for white, if not completely lost for black. So, rather than deal with all of that, Kasparov just decided to play passively, hang on to the a file. And now the computer made a very, very nice and very important strategic move. It saw that Kasparov had adequately defended the pressure on the queen side. And usually in chess, if you just play on one flank and creating one weakness is not enough to win a game, because usually your opponent can actively defend that weakness. You need to create a second weakness, open up a second front. And the idea is that with more space, you're tying your opponent's pieces down. If you create two weaknesses, then your opponent will have trouble shifting his pieces around back and forth, trying to defend both of the weaknesses, whereas it's easy for them to sort of just defend one. So that's why we see Deep Blue play the move f4. He wants to open the game up. And at this point, Kasparov has a choice to make. If he plays the move e takes f4, he's giving the computer the opportunity to play bishop takes f4, which puts pressure immediately on a weak pawn here, gives up his nice strong position in the center, and even allows Deep Blue at some point to play for this move e4, e5, which would free up this bishop on the diagonal looking at the king. So this is not really the kind of move that Kasparov wants to play. He wants to keep a blockade on this e5 point. This is a very common theme as black in a lot of the Roy Lopez positions. You really often want to keep a pawn here because in doing so, you're stopping white from at any point pushing this pawn forward and opening this bishop up. So he has a choice to make here. On the other hand, if he allows black to capture and then he recaptures with the e-pawn, which actually did happen in the game, this pawn on d5 will become a very strong protected pass pawn, which would give white an advantage in the endgame. On the other hand, if he plays a move like f6 to try to strong point e5, then he's taking that square away from the knight, and this knight is looking really silly on h7 with no real future in the game. So he chose sort of the lesser of these evils here, and he went with the move knight f6 just to try to get the knight back into the game. And Deep Blue did take on e5, and after d takes e5, now we see this protected pass pawn develop. So for those of you who are not aware what a pass pawn is a pawn that is got no pawns blocking it or able to capture it on its route to becoming a new queen in the endgame. And of course it's protected by this pawn here on e4. So any endgame is probably bad for black because he has to deal with this pass pawn. Meanwhile, he has no pass pawns of his own right now. So it's getting Deep Blue is slowly taking away opportunities and play from Kasparov in this position. So Deep Blue played the move queen to f1. This is something of a deep move. I'm not sure exactly what he wanted from this move. It could be possible that it was calculating that he wanted to play the knight now into f5, and if bishop takes, then to retake with the queen and get the queen into an active play. Possibly, maybe trying to play the move rook a2 and then queen to a1, so setting up a huge tripling onto the a file, and that would be very dangerous for black on the a file. And so Kasparov went into a strategic idea. He tried to establish what we call a blockade of this pass pawn. He played the move knight to e8. And what he's trying to do is put this knight here on d6 to blockade this pass pawn. To blockade means to prevent it from moving forward. And knights are always the best piece to establish blockades with because from there they can jump around. You don't want this bishop sitting here, because it's running into this pawn and it's tied down to this blockade. But knights are very agile, so they can blockade a pawn and still at the right moment jump around and try to become active pieces. And now Deep Blue switched its plan. He played the move queen f2, and the point of this move was to just take complete control of this open dark square diagonal. So now the bishop can roam sort of freely into positions like b6, c4, c5, these maybe a7 at some point. So a nice strategic move. And again, emphasizing that Deep Blue is meeting Kasparov toe to toe in this positional type of game, making very good moves. So now after knight d6, Deep Blue ventures the first piece into opponent territory. Played the move bishop to b6, and the queen has to stay on the 8th rank because of this capture, and then the rook would be hanging things. So he makes the move queen to e8 just to keep the defense of the rook on the a file. Now rook a2 was played. It's hard to explain this move. I've never seen an annotation of this game where anybody has some sort of concrete idea in this position. It's possible that Deep Blue really didn't have any good idea in this position. Maybe just wanted to get the rook off of any potential scope in this from this bishop. It seems odd to come up with a situation where this bishop would be attacking this rook right now, but these are the kinds of things that you consider when you're searching 200 million positions a second when you're a computer. Kasparov played the move bishop e7. Maybe he was just trying to getting a little bit tired in this position and trying to find some active play for his bishop, maybe coming in here and pinning this knight to the queen, trying to tie some stuff down. But the computer jumped on this opportunity and played the move bishop c5, attacking this knight and now eliminating the idea of this bishop from ever leaving the diagonal at the moment, because there's nothing to defend this knight anymore. So he's taking away mobility from the black pieces, and this is a very unusual way that a computer, you can force a computer to play like this back in the day, but they weren't particularly strong under these types of positions. And at this point, Kasparov sort of was running out of active ideas and didn't really know how to play this position. And I think this can go back to a psychological facet of his game, where Kasparov as a chess player was known for playing attacking, tactical, aggressive chess, where he was always looking for the initiative, always looking for attacking lines, did not like to play this type of game and would never play this type of game against a human. He was always willing to bet that he could out-calculate, out-tactically play a human opponent, and almost always he did. But it's not the same with the computer. So he's playing the type of game where he's not his most comfortable. And the move he plays is bishop f8, which is really sort of a waiting move. It's sort of a move that said, okay, I'm admitting that my plan with this bishop coming out here onto this diagonal doesn't really work, but I can't really come up with an active move. So I'm just going to wait around a little bit, play some move that doesn't change the position too much, and just force the computer to play a move that is active and to find a good plan. And the computer did. It played the move knight f5. And Kasparov decided that this knight had to go, because, of course, it's putting more pressure on this knight here on d6. And it's really sort of awkward for black to defend this knight, and maybe it's not even possible. He has to take it. We could retreat the knight, but then that would give up this nice blockade. So he decided to take this knight off with the bishop. But this cedes the bishop pair to white. Now white has the two bishops in this position, which is a bit of an advantage. This passed pawn, which is admittedly no longer protected, but Deep Blue is sort of converting some positional advantages into other advantages. And at this point, Kasparov plays the move f6. This move is interesting. It's an interesting defensive move. It stops this pawn from ever moving forward. This pawn would at some point possibly like to move to f6 in some kind of attack, thus freeing this bishop up. And maybe even right away, f6 was an interesting attacking idea, freeing the bishop up for some kind of attack against the king, and preparing maybe to get this bishop back here, sacrifice on h6. There are some attacking ideas, and Kasparov was just interested in shutting down any of that, and so he played f6 to stop the pawn from moving into f6, keep this bishop as somewhat of a bad bishop. And at this point, Deep Blue made an interesting move. He played bishop takes knight, and by doing so, he's trading off that good knight, which was really the only piece doing anything for Kasparov at the point. For now, this bishop, which has to sort of maintain the blockade of this pawn, and really has no future sitting on this diagonal. So very, very deep positional move there. And now, after bishop takes d6, Deep Blue decided to play a takes b5 and a takes b5. And now here came the move, which was extremely controversial at the time and sort of caused Garry Kasparov to go into a tailspin for the rest of this match, trying to figure out how the computer could possibly make a move like this. Because in this position, Kasparov having calculated this position, he's sort of essentially offering the chance for the computer to come in and win material. And the way that you might do this, and it's not necessarily by force, but probably would be a way for the computer to win material, would be to play this move, queen b6, in this position. This was the move that would be played by most computers. Even nowadays, they recommend this move as one of the top choices. And this was certainly what could reasonably have been expected to be played versus a computer back then, because this move is sort of winning pawns, offering a pawn by force to the computer. So Kasparov is saying, I'm going to let the queen side go in this, and I'll show you sort of an example of why. But I'm expecting to get some counterplay. I'm hoping to try to drum up some counterplay in this position. So what's going on here? let's just take a look. I'm not going to go too heavy into variations, but just some interesting things here. The queen is attacking this unprotected bishop and putting pressure on this pawn here. So an example variation might be rook takes rook, rook takes rook, and maybe a move like rook to d8, protecting the bishop. And now it's theoretically possible for white to come in and win a pawn, because he can just move this rook up here to a5. And I don't think there's a good way for black to really cover this pawn. So this position probably deep blue could have gotten. But the idea that Garry had in this position was to let the queen side go, even this pawn on the queen side, but to drum up some counterplay on the dark squares. Some of deep blue's moves had left a lot of these dark squares a little bit vulnerable, and we're into opposite color bishop situations. There's only a light square bishop for white here. He cannot defend these dark squares very easily. These pieces are far away. So he could have played in this position a move like e4, with the idea of bringing the queen down here to e5 and getting this queen and bishop battery on the dark squares down here and here. So he could definitely drum up a lot of counterplay for his sacrificed pawn by using this maneuver, even as another pawn sacrifice here, because of course, well, this pawn's not hanging right now because of the queen, but maybe at some point this pawn would be hanging also. But just generating some counterplay on these dark squares, which are unprotected by any pawns or pieces. So that's what Kasparov was hoping for when he played the move, this f6 and then bishop takes, a takes, and then a takes. That's what he was hoping for in this position. But now, deep blue played a move that was extremely long-term thinking about this type of counterplay that he might get. It said, yeah, I've got the opportunity to win pawns. And up until this point, computers had always done this. They'd always gone in for the material win of pawns. But deep blue didn't. It played the move 37, bishop e4. And the idea of this move is that deep blue was saying, I have all of this advantage on the queen side. I have the a file. That's not going away. It anticipated this counterplay on the dark squares and just stuck its bishop on e4 to blockade this e-pawn from ever moving forward and giving the queen a chance to come in here onto e5 and get any of this dark square counterplay. Well, this was like really unbelievable to Kasparov. He had never seen a computer make a move like this. Really it takes only the best humans really at that point to make such a strong positional move, to kill this counterplay. And he couldn't believe that a computer could do it at that point, especially given the way the computer had played in the game before. So deep blue killed the counterplay here and still maintained all of its advantages on the queen side. So let's see how the game continued. Kasparov played the move rook takes a2. The computer played queen takes a2. So now he has penetration into the queen side, and there's no way to challenge the a-file anymore. So this is sort of a big advantage, really a big advantage for black. Modern computers don't seem to think this is winning yet, but it's really very difficult for black at this point. This is winning in human terms, in other words. Kasparov played the move queen to e7, trying to defend the 7th rank. The computer played queen to a7, offering a queen trade, where if queen takes queen, rook takes queen, the rook comes in on the 7th rank, threatening to put the rook here, attacking this pawn. This is a very difficult situation. Maybe it's not holdable for black. So after queen e7, queen a7 was played, and Kasparov wanted to avoid any of these difficult positions with the rook on the 7th rank and such, so he played the move rook to c7, just trying to defend the 7th rank and not offer the queen trade. And the computer played the move queen b6, putting pressure on this weak pawn which has no defender. And the computer played rook b7, defending the pawn and attacking Kasparov played this move rather, and the computer found more ways into the position. It played rook to a8 check, attacking the king, getting on the 8th rank, king to f7. This is a very difficult position. Queen a6, keeping pressure here, attacking this rook. taking control again of the A file, and it's really, really difficult to suggest moves for black. Again, this bishop on E4 is just blockading this E pawn and eliminating any possible counterplay that Kasparov might be trying to come up with. And he played the move Queen C7, and now the computer offered the trade of queens, trying to get a passed pawn here on the C6. I thought I had some variations to look at, but I'm not going to do it. And so Garry Kasparov rather offered the trade of queens a different way by playing queen here. So if the queen takes here, the rook takes, maybe the position is still holdable. This is a check, of course. But Deep Blue wasn't interested in the queen trade under those circumstances. Just moved out of the way, king to F1. And Kasparov played rook to B8, just trying to trade some pieces. If rook takes, queen takes. If rook takes, queen takes, just trying to trade some pieces. If queen takes, rook takes, trying to trade more pieces. And now Deep Blue played the move rook to A6. This move virtually forces a trade of queens in this position, because the rook and the queen now, if the queen moves away, the bishop is undefended, so he's just losing a piece. And the game gets very, very difficult for Kasparov, because now forcing the queen trade after queen takes c6, d takes c6, now there's this protected pass pawn, and it's very, very difficult for Kasparov, possibly losing after a possible variation like bishop c7, rook a7 attacking the bishop, and if the bishop moves away, the pawn moves forward. After rook to c8, the game is over because of bishop check, king to f8, and now bishop e6. Attacking the rook, forcing it to move away from defense of this bishop. This is losing a piece, and in addition, this pawn is running home, and there's nothing that black can do, so this game is completely over. That's why those are the moves that Kasparov was looking at, and after this move, rook a6, he resigned the game. Couldn't think of any way to deal with this pressure that white had from the invasion on the queen side, and couldn't find a solution to this position, and just resigned the game, and the game was over, and Deep Blue won this game. Now the really interesting thing about this position is that this final position is actually a draw, and very famously Kasparov was so disappointed and distracted by this move from before, bishop e4, killing all this counterplay, this move that he thought no computer could ever make. And he just sort of was disgusted with his play, didn't look deep enough, I guess, because this was a draw that Kasparov probably should have been able to find. Some chess player in Germany later on in the day found this draw, and they told Kasparov about it later in the day, and he was so disgusted with himself for missing this opportunity. It looks really bad for white, but actually in this particular position, black has the miracle shot, queen e3, sacrificing this bishop and hoping for some perpetual checks against this rather exposed king. So let's examine some ways in which this might be possible. If the computer takes the pawn, queen takes d6, black must play the move rook to e8, covering this e6 square from the queen checks, and possibly being able to play rook to e7 to stop some checks. This provides just enough time and just enough defense for the king that he can actually get the series of perpetual checks in on the king now. So white has to figure something out, because this bishop is hanging on e4, and that could be a way for Kasparov to get back into the position. And so if he tries something like bishop f3 to try to save the bishop, be up a piece, and use the bishop to sort of block some of the checks against the king, it's still a perpetual check. After queen c1 check, king goes to f2, queen d2 check. If the bishop blocks, then there's queen f4 check, king e1, queen c1 check. Notice the queen is giving these checks along this diagonal, this weakened dark square diagonal, and there's no way for the king to avoid these checks. After bishop d1, there's queen c3 check, king f1, and now the move queen c1, threatening to take the bishop and renew these perpetual check threats. there's nothing to be done. There's no way to avoid the perpetual check for black in this situation. So for white in this situation. So for example, rook a7 check, just king g8. And there's no time for a move like queen d7, threatening the rook and mate, but it's just one move short. It's not enough, because black can play queen d1 check, king f2 only move, and now queen d2 check, and there's no way for white to escape the perpetual checks along the diagonal here. The queen can check here, and if the king goes to h2, there's the check here, and if the king goes to g1, there's the check here again, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, if g3 to try to block the checks, well, then there's this perpetual check, and there's no way to escape this one. So that particular variation is a draw. After taking the bishop, there's a draw. And I'll show one more interesting variation, where after queen takes d6 back here, if white tries the very deep and very inspired move h4 in this position, the idea is to give this king a hideaway square here on h3, a square where he might be safe from the perpetual checks. So for example, if black now plays queen takes e4, white has rook takes a7, king g8, queen d7, this move where we're double attacking the rook and threatening checkmate. There's no way to defend both of those threats, so black has to come up with a perpetual in this position, but there is none. After queen f4 check, king g1, queen e3 check, king h2, queen f4 check, king h3, queen e3 check, and g3. And there's no checks left in the position. There's no way for the queen. The queen doesn't have time to move into any position where it might give perpetual check and simultaneously defend the rook and the checkmate. So this is just losing. But after the move h4, black has the amazing response h5. And the point of this is that in all of these positions from before, after g3, there would be no check here. There was never a check here on h4. So for example, king h3, there's no check here for the queen because it's not a protected square, and the king can just take. But after h4, h5, all of these perpetual check ideas still exist because the queen is now protected on the square g4. So the game, and there are a lot of other variations that we could go into, but I'm not going to take the time to look at all of the variations. But those are just two examples of how, because of the weakened kings and the weakened dark squares, black actually had a chance to draw in this position, and Kasparov didn't go for it. So this was a really interesting game, and the first time really that Kasparov and that we saw a computer in a high-level match versus a world champion outplay it in a type of position that it wasn't supposed to be able to be outplaying humans in, and specifically made this move 37 bishop e4, killing any possible counterplay from black on the queen side. And as a result of this loss, Kasparov was unable to understand how this could possibly happen, thought that a human may have influenced the computer to make a move like this, and was constantly asking for the computer the IBM team to print out the log of the computer and what it was thinking about during this game, because the other issue is that he thought that the computer made all of these wonderful positional moves, but in the end played into a position where it simply missed this miracle shot queen e3 and the potential for all of these perpetual checks. So he was saying to himself, how could the computer be so strong to play this move, bishop e4, but just miss a really not so simple for high-level chess players, and certainly for a computer to be able to spot all these perpetual checks. So he couldn't understand how the computer could miss the perpetual checks and yet still play all of these strong moves like bishop e4. And he couldn't let it go. He was distracted by it for the rest of the match. After every match in the press conference, he was saying, give me the log, where are the printouts? I want you to prove to me that the computer could really do this. And the IBM team was like, oh, we're not going to show you the printouts. And he didn't win a game in the match after that. the next three games were drawn, and then he played a terrible game in game 6 of the match, lost it before the computer even started calculating. They were still on opening books, and he lost the game. And that will go down. That went down in chess history and human history as the first time a computer ever beat a chess world champion at his own game. And really, it was a result psychologically of Kasparov losing it at this point in the match and not being able to focus further on in the match. And so that's sort of a bit of the history and a bit of an explanation of this game, a famous game. And I hope you guys enjoyed it. Again, I didn't go into too much depth with the variations, but I hope you guys got something out of it anyway. And we will see you next time. Thanks for watching.